Right, okay. So warm welcome from the Cochrane Qualitative and Implementation Methods Group. It's a great privilege to be here, particularly joined by my colleagues, because although I'm the nominated information specialist for the group, our activities are very much collaborative, and both Kate and Jane have contributed to the evidence base on question formulation and searching, as you will see later. So just to remind you all that it's important to declare conflict of interest. I have no potential conflicts of interest. Obviously, I've written a lot and run workshops on this, but I don't stand to make money from what I present here or have any other material interests. And just a reminder that this is part of a series. We've thought very carefully about what people would like to know. This is the second in the series of 8, with 2 more following shortly, and details of the remaining 4 going into some of the details of synthesis to be released shortly. And for those of you who are particularly interested in this topic area, a lot of what I'll be saying today is based on the paper that collectively we wrote on methods for question formulation and searching and protocol development, published in the Journal of Clinical Epidemiology. So we'd like to get a feel for you in terms of your experience with searching for qualitative evidence. This may be for a qualitative evidence synthesis or just to support individual users who are looking for qualitative articles. So if you'd like to complete the poll, I can see that you're all very used to this, as the numbers are clicking over really quickly here. And obviously these are average times. Often we do this irregularly. And we notice here that most of you are involved in either weekly or monthly or several times a year. And then some of you who are attending, perhaps for more of an overview here, search either once a year, less frequently, with a small proportion of you not searching. And hopefully you will start searching as a result of the information we share to you. Just to say that I will be referring to several articles during the presentation, and if you go to the very beginning of the chat, there's a shortened URL that you can use to look at a bibliography of all articles cited in the presentation. We will put the longer version of the URL up at the very end, but for convenience you may want to use the short URL at the beginning of the chat at the moment. So just to start with the first part of our presentation on question formulation. So question formulation is something that those of you familiar with doing systematic reviews will realize is key. It's been said that if you ask a fuzzy question for a systematic review, you get a fuzzy answer, and that's equally true in qualitative synthesis. Some of the sorts of questions that we might want to answer listed here. So what's people's reaction to having a condition? What's their experience of receiving an intervention? It's important here pointing out that although the focus of Cochrane is very much on intervention reviews, that it may well be information about the experiences of having a condition that inform the qualitative perspective. And also worth mentioning that although realist synthesis, a completely different topic that's just starting to be used within Cochrane, seems to have cornered the market with the mantra of what works for whom under what circumstances, that qualitative research in conjunction with the effectiveness or effects reviews has been doing this for many years, and so it's certainly not a unique contribution just of realist synthesis. And I just wanted to introduce to you 3 question approaches, 3 ways of thinking about how your qualitative question can fit with an overall review. The way that Cochrane currently handles it, and we're likely obviously to see changes over the next few years with the speed of methods development, the way that it's currently handled is that there is an effectiveness review, and if qualitative evidence is rightly required to help us understand, perhaps in the form of acceptability or perhaps implementation, then a separate review is done almost as a parallel review. So there you have separate questions and separate reviews. Another approach which you see in some technology assessments is to have a combined review with separate sub-questions. So some of those questions relate to effectiveness, some to acceptability, and occasionally some to both. And probably what we're going to see a growth of in the future as method expertise increases is to see combined questions within a combined review. And here the terminology, as we'll see shortly, is using these sort of methods neutral words like impact or effects of. And obviously effects of, we saw the database for abstracts of reviews of effectiveness was changed to the database of abstracts of reviews of effects to recognize that both quantitative and qualitative reviews can answer questions about effects. So I just want to show you these three different approaches just as context for the material on questions. So here we have the parallel or complementarity approach. So you've got very much an effectiveness question in the left-hand side about effectiveness and harms. On the right-hand side, you've got a question exclusively for the qualitative research around acceptability. Another way of looking at this is to broadly interpret the effectiveness question to make it then inclusive of qualitative data. So here we have the terminology of benefits and harms. Initially, we might think of those in terms of positive and negative outcomes being measured quantitatively. But of course, you can interpret benefits and harms in the language of qualitative research in terms of feasibility, acceptability, and meaningfulness. And that's the framework popularized by the Joanna Briggs Institute. So all we've done here is we've expanded our understanding of benefits and harms to include things that impact upon the patient or upon carers, or indeed those delivering the intervention. And then an integrated question would look like this. So we would use a method neutral word like impact or effect, so that we make it clear that we're embracing the widest possible view of an intervention. So hopefully this gives you a little bit of context for how we might use questions before we go specifically into question formulation. And we've done a number of reviews for the World Health Organization, and very helpfully they populate the evidence to decision framework that they use for making recommendations with those that can be contributed by qualitative synthesis and those that will come from the intervention for effectiveness. The review of intervention effectiveness. And you can see that this also includes cost effectiveness. So the pink or red here relates to the qualitative contribution, and the grey to the to that for the effects of an intervention. There's no meaning as far as I can tell from the choice of colours here. So let's just give you a little bit of a framework for asking qualitative synthesis questions. I'd like you just to muse for a few seconds on what these illustrations have in common. Perhaps you recognize some of these illustrations as relevant to today's presentation. So you may have spotted some of these, but here are some of the acronyms used for structuring questions related to the qualitative component. And some of these relate to the equivalent, if you like, of the PICO question used for effectiveness, and some extend our idea of what we're trying to achieve. So, for example, Behemoth relates to looking for models and theories, which, although potentially important for quantitative as well, is certainly something that we find valuable for a number of qualitative syntheses. So we're not going to cover all of these, but not least because that they number certainly in the tens, but we're going to focus on 3 particular ones that you might find interesting or useful. But we have to acknowledge that as well as these sort of static approaches to a question, that increasingly, particularly with our interest in complex interventions, then we might well be interested in composing a logic model. And this logic model would, if you like, be made up of multiple versions of these questions, so for different parts of the overall complex problem. And I'll show you an illustration of that approach as well. So if you're interested in this area, we did do a rapid review of 38 different frameworks for formulating questions. It's quite a well-hidden appendix to the article that we wrote for the World Health Organization on formulating questions. And what we recognized is that the questions in many ways were deficient. Some of them didn't recognize setting or environment or context, which is really important for understanding qualitative research. Others didn't acknowledge that there could be different stakeholder perspectives. And some of them didn't build in issues of time and timing and place. And obviously that's linked to the context, but relates specifically to issues like whether the evidence is still timely and up to date, and whether evidence from, say, Kenya can be applied to Nigeria, for example. And what we were looking for was to see if these questions were sensitive to qualitative data. And we found that none of the 38 frameworks that we found satisfied all 4 criteria. So just taking you through the 3 sort of market leaders, if you like. The equivalent of the PICO question for an effectiveness review is argued by the Joanna Briggs Institute to be PICO with a small o, where the C and O relate to the context. And the advantages of using a question that resembles the original PICO are that it's a familiar model. It means that if you're planning on applying similar inclusion and exclusion criteria across your quantitative and qualitative questions, then there's a sort of matching there. And obviously, we've become very familiar with variants of PICO, such as Peacock from the social science world, and PICOS, which includes the study type. But some of the downsides of this is that the epidemiological model of a PICO question assumes that the target population is who you're interested in. So it doesn't allow for things like the phenomenon of male partners of women with breast cancer, or indeed the reverse, or for families' perspectives of children with cerebral palsy. In a population-based question, then it would be the children themselves who were the focus. And it may imply, we said this was an advantage, but it may imply, and this may be undesirable, that the quantitative and qualitative review questions are coterminous, that they have the same scope. Whereas Ruth Garside, another one of our colleagues, has reported that with Theo Lorenc, that very often you may need to go broader in terms of exploring the qualitative phenomenon. So what's it like to have a condition or to have to cope with implementing an intervention, say, in your home? You may have to go broader than a specific intervention that may be the focus of your effectiveness question. So as an example here, one close to my heart, literally and metaphorically. So you've got working males as your patient or population, the defibrillator, the implanted defibrillator as the phenomenon of interest, and your context here Not very precise, but certainly one that maps to existing reviews, a change in perception of illness role. So this is the Joanna Briggs model of using an adapted PICO specific for qualitative. The second alternative is SPICE. It's memorable because of the UK's contribution to world culture, the Spice Girls, getting you to tell me what you want, what you really, really want. It recognises that qualitative research is specific to context and that perspective is important. The comparison is optional because you are not always interested in a comparison of one intervention against another with qualitative research. And it softens the idea of outcomes to the more encompassing term of evaluation. But this wasn't specifically designed for qualitative review questions. I was originally intervention, but has been amended to now indicate phenomenon of interest. And as mentioned, often there may not be a comparison. And when you say evaluation, people don't always realize immediately that this refers to themes, findings, experiences, attitudes, etc. So here's a SPICE in action. So we have a question here about the information needs of male partners who are caring for women who have suffered a stroke. You can see here that by separating the male partner's perspective out, that we have, in fact, two populations. We have the population who are suffering or encountering, and we have the population who are perceiving. And that's a really helpful distinction to make. And then the third option that we're just going to briefly mention, just because of its novelty, is perspective. Perspective was developed after doing that review of 38 options. It was done as part of methodological work that Kate and Jane and myself were involved with many others on complex interventions. Now, perspective isn't the most memorable. It's got more elements to remember, and it's not a case of one letter per element, which the other two are. And also recognizing that the comparison is optional, we use the copyright symbol, which led to great excitement when we got to the proofreading stage. But just to show how it accommodates a wider perspective, no pun intended, you can see here that it brings in some important elements of qualitative research. It brings in the setting, so where the treatment is being delivered, in this case in a hospital. It looks at the wider environment because there could be systemic differences between private and public healthcare. It allows for timing because there could be a progression along a pathway or along the trajectory of a disease. So there you have a choice of frameworks. Some of these you may be familiar with and already be using, and others you have just been introduced to you. So we'd like you to imagine that you're going to be starting a qualitative review perhaps next month and indicate in the poll what your preferred question format would be. The results of the jury, the Joanna Briggs method of PICO, 27%. The SPICE option, 22%, the perspective, the new kid on the block, 14%, some other choice, 4%, and about a third of you don't have a preferred option. So hopefully you'll be able to access the article that we shared earlier and learn a little bit more about each of those frameworks. So moving on. We mentioned that you don't necessarily just have to use these static frameworks. So here is a logic model devised by another colleague of ours, Megan Boren, for a Cochrane qualitative synthesis. And what you see here is a number of these, if you like, PICO-type relationships going on here, and they've been mapped into an overall logic model. These models can be used at the beginning of a review as a way of consulting with stakeholders, for example. They can be used at the end of the review as a way of presenting results, and they can be used by the team throughout the review in mapping where the questions lie and addressing the evidence. And just showing you that in a practical sense, here's one from a WHO review that I participated in. This was on risk of infection from Zika when breastfeeding. And you'll notice here that this is a logic model for all the reviews. But if you focus on the pink elements for the purposes of this lecture, you'll see the values and preferences of the health worker constitutes one question. The values and preferences of lactating women is another question. Community support to the one who's breastfeeding in terms of family or the community is another qualitative question. And the values and preferences of lactating women in reference to once the child has an infection as opposed to, once the woman has an infection as opposed to anticipating that, which was the earlier pink question. So we can see that there are a number of review questions. Okay, so just to summarize on question formulation is not only important in its own right, it's a way of communicating among the team what you're going to cover logistically, but it also informs subsequent processes. So it informs the eligibility criteria, the articles you're looking for. It will inform the searching in terms of what concepts you're going after, and it will inform the data extraction in terms of the variables that you want to extract. So, for example, if there are multiple perspectives, you'll have multiple fields for perspective on your data extraction form. All of the question formats possess their own advantages and disadvantages, so we're not in a position of recommending a single one, but probably in that connection it's worth thinking that probably the process of going through question formulation is the most important thing, that the formula that you choose won't be that critical, but as long as you can get the team and your stakeholders and all those involved in the review to actually get agreement on the question and the relationships within it, then that's the important deliverable. So we're going to pause for questions. I realise that was very much an overview. So have we got some questions, Kate?
We do indeed. Thanks very much, Andrew, and good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, or good evening. Lovely to be with you today. So we've got some good questions coming in, and there's a few more flying into the chat box now. But the earlier arrivals were there's a great one from Andrew Halls asking, how do you formulate your question if you're using mixed methods, reconciling both broadness and specificity? There you go. That's one for you, Andrew, without a doubt.
Right. Yeah. Thank you. So yeah, it does link to this question about whether you're going to use a combined question or not, because if you're going to use a combined question, then you might choose to use a combined question framework. So, for example, a question framework like Perspective might be better for actually combining those. We haven't mentioned Spider, mainly because this isn't a session on mixed methods, but Spider is an option that allows you to specify both the quantitative and qualitative elements. My other consideration, if you like, is the next stage when you come to searching. If you're going to search just across the topic area and then sort into your quantitative and qualitative, then there are advantages of having a single question framework. If you're going to search for two bodies of literature, one, for example, perhaps randomized controlled trials using search filters that pick out that study type, and then another search strategy for qualitative, then the advantages of having separate questions is paramount there. So I would say that although it sounds like an easy question to answer, you actually have to go further upstream to that decision about how you're going to handle the review as a whole, and then that will actually point to you the options for making these sensitive and specific enough.
That's great, thank you, Andrew. And that, I think, has answered another question that Faith Agbozo had put in, which is what approach is most ideal for mixed methods type of review. So we've covered that off quite nicely there. And also about SPIDER. Andrew Husband had asked about why SPIDER was not mentioned here. So the final question that's come in for now, I'll keep my eye on it, and Jay may pick up on some others. Louise Shaxton has said she's undertaking a review which is not about assessing the effects or effectiveness of an intervention, but more about understanding about how people within an organisation has developed their own systems. And she's saying that she struggled to apply PICO, which I think quite a lot of people do, don't know? We've got experience of actually, for me, it always feels a little bit like you're trying to put a square peg into a round hole. If you try and use a PICO question for a more qualitative approach. She says that, perspective seems to be broad enough to handle it, but do we have any thoughts?
Yeah, well, I think it's good that, for example, SPICE has setting in there as well, and obviously that was one of the reasons why that we had setting and environment, both of those in perspective. So yeah, I certainly agree that PICO isn't the best choice for that. Just a quick side point as well regarding the questions from SPIDER is that subsequent to the publication of SPIDER, we have realised that when it comes to searching, that the D and the E and the R of SPIDER should be combined with OR. I think it was initially interpreted, certainly by some readers, and possibly misleading in our original article, that people read it as design and evaluation and research type. So just a little note there. So hopefully I've sort of covered both of those sets of questions.
Yeah, and an interesting observation just came in from Marshall Dozier about the use of question formulation frameworks by students is that they tend to over-specify both in question formulation and in the search stages. And I think this can sometimes be a little bit of an over-reliance on it. And it's kind of those guiding principles to really focus people down. But there is that sense sometimes people can get a little bit hung up on them.
That's a really good point. Thank you, Marshall, and good to hear from you. And thanks, Kate, for relaying that. What I would say is that it's very important when teaching this to make it clear that these frameworks are relating to both the searching and the study selection. And it just happens that we've, sort of put a boundary. Study selection will be handled in the next lecture to be given by Jane and myself. But really, the full framework can only be applied through both of those. It's rare to apply the framework simply at the search stage, and I think that's where the students' confusion comes in. So if we can get them to see the full picture, then they work a lot better. Thank you for that.
Thanks, Andrew. I think that's it for now. Amanda Mason-Jones put a question in, can we point to any examples where perspective has been used? And I'll put one in the chat box.